My name is Earl Sutton. I'm 59 years old, and I live alone in a little house on the edge of Millbrook, Tennessee. Population just under 4,000 if you count the families out along the ridge roads. I've been here my whole life. I went to school here, taught here for 31 years, and eventually ended up running the place as principal, until the district let me retire with a handshake and a cake shaped like a book. Margaret always thought that was funny. She said they should have made it look like a reading chair, since that was the one thing I actually loved more than anything at work. The chair she meant was hers. A wide, cream-colored armchair she'd pulled close to the front window so she could read in the afternoon light. It's still there. I haven't moved it since she passed 3 years ago, and I don't intend to. Some things in a house aren't furniture anymore. They're company. I don't need much. A small pension, an old pickup that starts reliably enough when the weather is warm, a back porch that looks out over a stretch of land Margaret's family had owned for 2 generations, about 4 acres of flat, quiet ground that we'd always talked about turning into something for the neighborhood. She never got to see that happen. After she died, I put the idea away, along with most things that required a future. For a long time, the days were just days. I heated soup. I read. I walked the land in the evenings and tried to feel close to her. My neighbor Harold checked on me weekly, which I appreciated, even when I said I didn't need it. People leave a space when they go. You either fill it, or you learn to live around it. I was still learning. Then a few months back, something started moving in Millbrook that I hadn't seen coming. Darren Fitch, the kind of man who buys things not because he needs them, but because owning them means someone else can't, had set his eyes on that land behind my house. I didn't know yet what he was willing to do about it. What I found out first, at the annual harvest dinner at Millbrook Community Hall, was Nora. It was the first Saturday of October. I'd almost stayed home, but Margaret had loved that dinner. She'd helped organize it for a dozen years. Going felt like honoring something, so I put on my good gray shirt, drove down, and sat at the end of a long table near the windows. The hall was loud. Half the town was there. Darren Fitch was near the front, shaking hands, laughing at his own comments. I watched him a moment, then turned back to my plate. That's when she sat down next to me. She set her tray down without looking, pulled back the chair, then glanced over and smiled. Quick, a little uncertain, the smile of someone new to a place who isn't sure which rules apply. "Hope this seat's not saved," she said. "It's not," I said. "It hasn't been for a while." She looked at me like she'd caught something in that answer, some weight she hadn't expected. Then she held out her hand. "Nora Vance. I just started at the elementary school. Art. Earl Sutton. I used to run the school. Before your time." She laughed. Not at me, but at the situation. It was a warm laugh. Honest. I noticed because I hadn't heard much of that in a while. From across the room, someone saw us and leaned to whisper to the person beside them. A table away, 2 men from the county planning board glanced over and smiled at each other, the kind of smile that carries a judgment. I saw it. 59 years old, 31 years reading rooms full of people who thought they were being subtle. I saw it clearly. I let it go, and turned back to Nora and passed her the bread. The harvest dinner lasted about 2 hours, and somehow Nora and I talked for most of it. She asked about the school. I asked about Nashville, where she'd come from, and she told me about the apartment she'd given up and the reason she'd wanted somewhere smaller. She didn't say the whole reason that night, but she said enough. "I needed a place where people didn't already have a fixed idea of who I was," she said, pulling apart a piece of bread. "That's harder to find than you'd think." I understood that more than I told her. I said something about Millbrook forming its opinions quickly, and she laughed and said she'd noticed. The following Monday, Harold mentioned that people had been talking. Someone had taken a picture at the dinner, me and Nora at that table, and shared it on the neighborhood group. The caption was something like, "New teacher already keeping company with old Earl." I told Harold to put the phone away. The next week, Nora was in the school supply room when I stopped by to drop off donated books. She called out my name from down the hall, and we talked a few minutes near the front door. She mentioned she'd heard what people were saying. She was matter-of-fact about it, the way people are when they've been talked about before, and learned not to flinch. "Does it bother you?" she asked. "Not the way it might have," I said. "When you've been through something real, Other people's imaginations don't carry as much weight. She was quiet a moment. Then, I was with someone for 2 years back in Nashville. 29. Charming. Seemed to know exactly what he wanted. He proposed to me at a friend's party. The whole room watching. 2 weeks later, I found out he'd been with someone else the entire time. He let mutual friends know before he told me directly. I had to hear about my own breakup from strangers. She said it without drama, the way you describe something that hurt you badly enough that you've put distance between yourself and the feeling. So no, people talking doesn't bother me much anymore. I just watch what they actually do. I didn't know what to say, so I nodded. She looked at me and said, "You're the only person in Millbrook who has talked to me without trying to sell me something or get information about the school budget." 6 weeks in. That's not a small thing. A week later, she brought a thermos of coffee to the community garden planning meeting at Town Hall. She'd heard I was going and signed herself up as a volunteer. Afterward, walking to our trucks in the cold, she said something I've thought about many times since. People think the problem with older men is that they're set in their ways. What I figured out is, that's actually the good part. A man who knows who he is doesn't have to perform for you. We stood in the cold parking lot. She looked at me, steady, clear-eyed, not searching for anything. "I've known who I am for a long time," I said. "Didn't always know what to do with it." She smiled. Not the quick, polite smile from the dinner, but something slower. "That makes two of us," she said, and got in her truck. It didn't happen all at once. That's not how things happen when you're my age, or when you've been careful with yourself for a long time. It came in pieces, the way a field comes back in spring, one small green thing at a time, and then one day you look out and the whole ground has changed. The community garden planning was my entry back into the world, I think. Margaret had wanted it for years. 4 acres of flat ground, good afternoon sun. She used to stand at the back window in the evenings and describe what she'd put there. Tomatoes along the south fence, a section for school children, herbs near the gate. I'd promised her I'd do something with it, and then she was gone and I couldn't make myself think about it. The land just sat. It was still sitting when Nora started showing up to the planning meetings. She was good at it. Art teacher instincts, Harold said. She could look at a blank patch of ground and see arrangement, color, proportion. She brought a sketch one afternoon, pencil on graph paper, showing how the garden might be divided into sections. There was a spot she'd labeled "Memory Corner" in neat handwriting, a small bench drawn in. She hadn't explained it to anyone, but when I looked at it, I felt something move in my chest and thought, she understood without being told. We worked out there on Saturday mornings when the weather allowed. She brought coffee every time, in the same blue thermos, and I stopped pretending I didn't appreciate it. I started bringing things too. Work gloves that fit her better than me, a bag of soil amendment good for clay ground. Small things, practical things, the kind of giving that doesn't announce itself. One Saturday in November it got cold fast. The temperature dropped while we were staking the bed lines, and neither of us had brought enough layers. I had a heavy canvas jacket in the truck bed. I went and got it without saying anything and held it out to her. She looked at it, looked at me, and put it on. She had to roll the sleeves up 4 times to find her hands. She looked a little ridiculous and completely warm. She didn't give it back when we went inside. She wore it the rest of the afternoon. We started eating lunch together after the morning sessions. There was a diner on Elm Street, pegs, booths along the wall, coffee strong enough to reset a person. Nora always ordered the same thing, turkey melt on sourdough, cup of vegetable soup, and she always moved her phone face down when she sat, which I noticed because Margaret had done the same. She believed that eating together was supposed to mean looking at each other. We talked about everything except what we were doing. That was fine. 31 years of running a school teaches you that people tell you the important things sideways, and that the best thing you can do is keep showing up so they have somewhere to put it. She told me about her family. Her father, gone when she was 17, whom she'd loved enormously and lost too fast. Her mother in Knoxville, proud and baffled by her daughter's choices. A younger brother who played guitar in a band that never quite made it. I told her about Margaret. I hadn't talked much about Margaret to anyone since the funeral. I think I was protecting myself, not the memory. But one afternoon at Peg's, Nora asked what she'd been like, and I told her. How Margaret laughed at her own jokes before she'd finished them. How she'd read 3 books at once and kept them all straight. How she'd known the name of every student who came through the school and asked after each of them by name at dinner, even on evenings when I was tired and didn't want to. How she'd made the house feel like somewhere. Nora listened to all of it without looking away. When I finished, she said quietly, "She sounds like someone who took care of things the right way." I nodded, and we sat in the comfortable quiet that had started to grow between us. One Saturday morning in December, I drove up to the land and found Nora already there, standing in the frost with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the back corner where the memory corner bench would go. She didn't hear me pull up. I walked over and stood beside her, and neither of us said anything for a while. A thin mist lay over the ground. The light was gray and early, and the whole field looked like it was resting. "I keep thinking about what it'll look like in May," she said finally. "Margaret saw it in May," I said, "in her head, every year." Nora turned and looked at me. Something passed across her face, not pity, nothing like that. Recognition. "We're going to make it real for her," she said. "That's what we're doing." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. I just stood there in the cold December morning, beside this young woman who had walked into my life 2 months ago, standing in the place Margaret had loved, saying the true thing out loud. I felt, for the first time in 3 years, like the world had reoriented itself, not back to what it was, but towards something. We walked the bedlines and made adjustments and talked about soil temperatures and seed timing. On the way out, she took my arm briefly on the uneven ground near the gate, a purely practical gesture, and let go when the path leveled. We drove separately to Peg's. We ordered the same things we always ordered. She put her phone face down. I held my coffee mug with both hands because my fingers ached in the cold. It was Harold who said it first. "You're different," he told me one evening on his porch. "You've got a reason to be somewhere in the morning." I told him I had the garden. He looked at me. "All right," I said. "I have the garden, and someone to talk to while I'm working on it." He nodded the way a man nods when he's been proven right, but doesn't want to make a thing of it. I appreciated that about Harold. By January, Nora had a key to the supply shed on the land. I had handed it over one afternoon when my hands were full, and she needed to get inside, and then it never came back to me, and I noticed and said nothing. She started leaving things inside: gardening gloves, a seed catalog with pages folded over, a photograph she'd printed and tacked to the inside wall, a garden in Virginia, arched trellises and a long central path, the kind of image that showed what a thing could become. I found the photograph on a morning she wasn't there. I stood and looked at it for a while in the cold shed light. Then I drove to the hardware store and priced out the materials for a trellis. Near the end of January, we'd stayed late going over the spring planting schedule by lamplight. The walk back to the trucks was longer than usual because we'd come in from the far gate. Halfway across the field, she stopped and looked up. Clear night, winter stars, the kind of cold that makes the sky look scrubbed clean. My father used to say that if you stood still long enough outside, the world would eventually show you something worth seeing, she said. He was right, I said. She looked at me then, not at the sky. Looked at me the way you look at someone when you've stopped pretending you're just friends. Her face in the cold dark was steady and warm and serious. "Earl," she said, "I need you to know I'm not here because I have nowhere else to be. I'm here because I want to be. I just needed you to know that clearly." I took that in. I said, "I know it." She nodded once. We walked the rest of the way to the trucks. I drove home and stood in the kitchen for a long time without turning on the lights, thinking about what it meant to want a future, and to find, against all expectation, that you still could. Darren Fitch had made his money the way the second generation of a wealthy family often does, not by building anything new, but by leveraging what was already there. His father had been a genuine developer, the kind who put up factories and housing on speculation, and sometimes lost and sometimes won. Darren had taken what his father left and turned it into a system: buy land, wait, sell at the right moment. He had an instinct for timing and no particular interest in what happened to anything after the transaction closed. He'd had his eye on the 4 acres behind my house since before Margaret died. He'd approached her once, years back. She'd sent him away politely but firmly, The land had been in her family for 2 generations and she had plans for it. After she was gone, he waited about 8 months and then sent me a letter through his attorney. I wrote back that the land was not for sale. He sent a second letter. I didn't answer it. That, as far as he was concerned, was when the gloves came off. I didn't see most of what he was doing at first. While I was walking the field in the evenings and having coffee at Peg's and watching the first green things push up in the beds Nora and I had built, Darren was moving pieces. He got himself onto a county planning subcommittee. He made friends with 2 members of the town council. He began making comments in public, at the hardware store, at the diner, at Lions Club meetings he'd newly started attending, about how the land behind the old Sutton place was going to waste, and what a shame it was that one man's sentimentality was blocking something that could benefit the whole community. He always called it that, old man's sentimentality. I heard it fourth hand before I heard it directly. The man from the county recorder's office came to my door on a Tuesday morning in February. He was apologetic, which I've found means the news is bad but the messenger isn't responsible. He handed me a document explaining that a consent form had been filed with the county, bearing what appeared to be my signature, agreeing to transfer the parcel to Fitch Development LLC. A public hearing had been scheduled for March 14th to finalize the transaction. I stood on my porch and read it twice. My signature was there. It was not mine. I knew my own signature. 31 years of diplomas and discipline reports and budget approvals. I knew exactly how I held a pen. The letters on this paper were right, but the pressure was wrong, and the way the S in Sutton finished was not how mine finished. Someone had studied it from a public record and reproduced it carefully. I called a lawyer in Knoxville that afternoon. She told me what I'd need: proof the signature wasn't mine, documentation of my intent, and a procedural basis to challenge the hearing. She said 3 weeks wasn't much time. I told her I'd see what I could find. Darren's approach to opposition was not to fight it directly, but to make the opponent seem unreasonable. In the weeks that followed, a narrative circulated through Millbrook. Earl Sutton was bitter. Earl Sutton had been alone too long. Earl Sutton was confused about what he'd signed. After all, he was getting on in years. He'd been through a lot. Maybe he didn't remember. Someone started a thread on the neighborhood group suggesting a man in grief shouldn't be making major property decisions. I was named in it. At Peg's one morning, a man I barely knew came to my booth and said he was sorry about my situation, in a tone that meant he'd already decided I'd lost. At the post office, 2 women whose children I'd known as students looked past me. Word moves fast in a small town. Once a narrative gets going, it becomes the one people reach for. Harold came over that evening and sat at my kitchen table without being asked. "Tell me what you need," he said. I told him I needed documentation showing, clearly and before the current dispute, that I'd planned to use this land as a community trust, something dated, something that predated the forgery. "There are letters," Harold said. "Margaret wrote to the county extension office years back about the soil testing, about converting the land to community use. She copied the school district on some of them." I looked at him. "She was thorough," he said simply. "Nora had a key to the shed. She also knew where the school district's correspondence archives were kept, in the old records room off the main hallway, boxes of filed paper going back decades. The school secretary, Mrs. Hensley, who had worked that desk since before I was principal, let Nora in without many questions. Nora had a way of making requests feel natural rather than urgent. She called me from the school parking lot on a Thursday evening. "Earl, there are 4 letters in here from Margaret to the county extension office, dated 2016 through 2019. 2 of them explicitly describe the land as a community trust parcel. One quotes a legal framework." She paused. "And there's one more, a letter from an attorney, a trust consultation letter, addressed to the school district because Margaret wanted them as a co-party, dated March 2019. It describes the parcel as a community land trust by intent, not to be sold without multi-party consent." But Chent went. I sat down at my kitchen table. March 2019, 5 years before Darren's forgery, 4 months before Margaret was diagnosed. "I'm photographing everything," Nora said. "I'll bring it to your lawyer tonight." I sat there thinking about Margaret at her desk in the evenings, writing letters I'd known about in general, but never followed closely, because she was always the one who tracked those things. She'd known what she was doing. She'd put it in writing. She'd copied institutions that would hold the record. From 5 years in the past, she had handed us exactly what we needed. "Thank you," I said to Nora. It wasn't enough, but it was all I had. The days before March 14th were the hardest. Not because I doubted the evidence, because the town had already begun to decide. And watching people you've known for decades accept a version of you that isn't true is a particular kind of loneliness. Darren was everywhere, confident, talking loudly about the improvements he had planned. An upscale market, a boutique inn, something that would bring real investment to Millbrook. He made sure the word investment reached the right ears. He made sure the word old stayed attached to anything involving me. I let my lawyer do her work. I walked the land every evening, and for the first time since Margaret died, I sat down in her reading chair. I'd avoided it for 3 years, but now I sat in it and read those letters until I knew their contents cold. Outside the window, the town went about its business. Inside, I was getting ready. The March 14th hearing was held in the main room of Millbrook Town Hall, the same room as the harvest dinner 6 months earlier. The tables were arranged differently, council members along the front, chairs filling in behind, but the smell was the same. Old wood and floor wax and coffee from the urn near the door. I arrived 20 minutes early with my attorney, Patricia Cho, who had driven from Knoxville that morning and who looked, in her dark coat and reading glasses, exactly as prepared as she was. The room filled, 30, then 40, then close to 60 people. Former colleagues from the school, the hardware store owner, 3 women from the garden committee, Harold near the back in his good jacket, and Nora, second row, a leather folio in her lap containing the originals of Margaret's letters and the trust consultation document, which Mrs. Hensley had authorized her to bring on the school district's behalf. Darren Fitch sat to the right with 2 attorneys and a paralegal, wearing the contained confidence of a man who believed the paperwork was already done. He glanced at me once when I came in. A brief, assessing look, then he turned back to his team. The council chair, Gerald Oakes, opened the proceedings. The county had received a consent to transfer document bearing Earl Sutton's signature. A formal contest had been filed. Tonight's purpose: determine the validity of the consent form and any competing claims on the parcel. Darren's lead attorney went first, smooth and organized. He laid out the chain, the consent form, the filing date, the transfer agreement. He acknowledged the contest but called it a last-minute attempt to block a transaction that had been duly and voluntarily executed. He said voluntary twice. He said clear and documented consent 3 times. He did not look at me. Then Patricia stood. She began with the signature, a forensic document examiner's report, expedited, 3 days turnaround, detailed the pressure differentials and compared the signature against 27 authenticated samples from my years of school records. The examiner's conclusion was unambiguous. The signature on the consent form had not been produced by the same hand. Forgery was the technical term. Patricia read that word aloud and let it sit. The room was quiet. Darren's attorney objected to admissibility. Gerald Oakes noted this was an administrative proceeding, not a courtroom, and that documentation bearing on the consent form's validity was within scope. He asked Patricia to continue. She introduced Margaret's 4 letters to the county extension office, 2016 through 2019, each describing the parcel as intended for community land trust use, predating the consent form by 5 to 9 years. Then she asked Nora to come forward. Nora walked to the front. She was calm. Dark green blouse, the serious meeting blouse she'd called it, and the leather folio held in both hands. She introduced herself for the record. Nora Vance, Millbrook Elementary, acting as authorized representative of the school district for the purpose of presenting archival documentation. She placed the final document before Gerald Oakes. The trust consultation letter, March 2019. Attorney's letterhead. The parcel described as a community land trust by stated intent, naming the school district as prospective co-party. Margaret's signature at the bottom. This document was in the school district's files, Nora said quietly. It has never been destroyed or altered. It predates the consent form by 5 years and establishes that the property was already designated as a community trust by its co-owner. Under county statute, a community trust designation requires multi-party consent to dissolve. No such process was ever initiated or documented. She looked at Gerald Oakes. There is no valid consent to transfer. There never was. Darren said something low and fast to his attorney. His face had lost the smoothness it had carried for 2 months. Gerald examined the document. Then he looked at Darren's table. Does counsel have a response? The attorney asked for a 10-minute recess. I sat still while Patricia organized her folders. The room murmured. Nora returned to her seat. Harold caught my eye from the back and gave me a slow nod. When the recess ended, Darren's attorney did not return to the podium. Darren himself stood. He said there may have been a miscommunication in the preparation of the consent documentation. He said his team had operated in good faith on information provided to them. He said no intent to misrepresent had been present at any stage. This is the moment I want you to understand. He did not know about the recording. 6 weeks earlier, Darren had called the attorney who handled his county filings from his office phone, which his paralegal routinely recorded for billing purposes. That paralegal, a young man named Chris who had his own reasons by that point for no longer wanting to work for Darren, had preserved the recording and provided it to Patricia voluntarily. Patricia set a small recorder on the table and pressed play. Darren's voice came through clearly. He said they needed a signature that would hold up long enough to get through the county filing window, because once it was in the system, it would be the old man's problem to fight. And a man like that doesn't have the resources or the energy to fight it properly. He said they'd use the agricultural variance as cover while the transfer went through. He said the Memorial Garden angle was sentimental garbage, and sentiment didn't build equity. The room was entirely silent. Gerald Oakes reached over and turned off the recorder. He looked at it a moment. Then he looked at Darren Fitch, who was standing very still in the way people stand when they've understood that something irreversible has just happened. Gerald said, "This hearing is suspended, pending referral to the county sheriff and district attorney for criminal investigation into the authenticity of the consent documentation." He said it quietly, without drama. He closed the folder in front of him. "Mr. Sutton's parcel remains under his ownership. This matter is not subject to further administrative proceeding at this level. Thank you all for being here." No gavel, no speech. Gerald Oakes had been running meetings in Millbrook for 12 years, and he knew that the cleanest way to close something is to close it. People stood. Noise came back into the room. I sat for a moment without moving while Patricia gathered her files. Harold worked through the crowd toward me, and Nora was standing at the end of the row, waiting, the leather folio under her arm, watching me with the same steady look she'd had that night in the winter field when she told me she was there because she wanted to be. I walked over to her. I said, "Thank you." She said, "Margaret did the work. I just found it." "You knew where to look," I said. She held my gaze a moment. Then she smiled, slow, real, the kind that doesn't have anywhere to be. And she put her hand on my arm, and we walked out into the cold March air together, while Millbrook sorted itself out around us. Darren Fitch was indicted on 2 counts of document fraud that spring. His attorneys negotiated a plea. He paid a substantial fine, gave up his planning subcommittee seat, and moved his business operations to another county. I don't know where he is now, and I don't need to. The land became official in June. Millbrook Community Garden and Memorial Park. That's what the county sign says, the small green one by the eastern gate. Below the name, in smaller letters, "In memory of Margaret Sutton, who saw it first." That was Nora's line. She'd drafted the designation language herself and slipped it in without telling me. I read it the day they installed the sign and had to stand with my back to the road for a while to collect myself. The beds came in beautifully that first season. Tomatoes along the south fence, exactly where Margaret had always said. A children's section with low beds along the east side. Herbs near the gate. Basil, thyme, rosemary, lavender, so you smell them as you come in, which Nora had planned deliberately. The memory corner bench arrived in May, hand-built by a man named Warren who ran the woodshop at the vocational school and said he'd known Margaret and wanted to do something. He wouldn't take payment. Nora and I were married in September, quietly, in the back garden. Harold officiated. He'd gotten the paperwork online, which he was very pleased about. Mrs. Hensley was there, and Warren, and Nora's mother from Knoxville, who spent the first hour studying me carefully, which I respected. By the second hour, she was at the potluck telling someone about Nora's childhood, and I took that as a good sign. It's December now as I sit down to tell you this. The garden is resting under its winter mulch. The light comes in low and long through the front windows in the afternoon. Margaret's chair is still there by the window. I haven't moved it, and I won't. But I sit in it now. I sat in it for the first time the night of the town hall hearing, and I've sat in it most evenings since. It fits differently than I expected, softer, like something that had been waiting. Nora is in the kitchen making the Sunday soup, white beans and rosemary, the kind that fills the whole house. In the spring, she told me last week, May, she thinks, just when the garden is coming back, we are going to have a child. She said it at the kitchen table with both hands around her coffee mug, looking at me the way she looks at things she's already decided. I sat with it. Then, I said I thought May was a good time for things to begin. She smiled and said, "It really is. I've been thinking about what I'd tell someone who was where I was 3 years ago, alone in the house, moving around the chair, calling a can of soup enough. I think I'd tell them this. A life doesn't change because you planned it carefully. It changes because you said yes at the right moment, because you passed the bread, because you showed up when you didn't feel like it, and you listened when someone sat down beside you, and you let them see you, and you didn't apologize for being who you were. The years don't disappear. They don't need to. They're the thing that makes you someone worth trusting. The right person doesn't see your years as a problem to explain. They see them for what they are. Evidence that you endured, that you kept your word, that you're still here.
I am still here.
And in May, one more of us will be.